On Mother's Day morning, while Claire Montgomery was still processing the attorney's phone call that had just made her the sole heir to her late father's $900 million pharmaceutical empire, her husband Derek stood in their kitchen and called her pointless. The word hung in the air like poison as their two children, Emma and Lucas, sat frozen over their barely touched pancakes, watching their mother's face crumble. Derek had been waiting for this moment, Claire realized, watching the cruel satisfaction lash across features she'd once loved. He'd been planning this, rehearsing the lines about how she contributed nothing, how she was just a stay-at-home mom with no ambition, no value, no future. What Derek didn't know, couldn't possibly know because the inheritance documents were still sitting unopened in Claire's trembling hands behind her back, was that his pointless wife had just become one of the wealthiest women in America. The pharmaceutical empire her estranged father had built, the same father who'd cut her off 15 years ago when she'd married Derek against his wishes, had been left entirely to her in a stunning deathbed reconciliation she'd learned about only 30 minutes earlier. But Derek wasn't finished destroying her yet. He slid divorce papers across the breakfast table, right next to Emma's Mother's Day card with its crayon hearts, and told Claire he was marrying Vanessa, his assistant, the woman he'd been sleeping with in the same bed Claire had bought with her wedding gift money. The mistress who was already 3 months pregnant with his child, the woman who'd been calling their home, laughing with their children, sitting in Claire's seat at company dinners for 6 months. Derek's construction company, the business Claire had helped build by working 3 jobs to fund his startup while pregnant with Emma, the company where she'd done the bookkeeping for 5 years before the kids needed her home, was flourishing now. He didn't need her anymore, he said. He'd outgrown her. Vanessa was sophisticated, ambitious, someone who mattered in the business world, not some pointless housewife who'd let herself go. Claire looked at her husband, really looked at him, seeing clearly for the first time how much of her soul she'd poured into a man who'd been waiting for the moment he could afford to discard her. The attorney's folder felt heavy in her hands. The words Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings, $900 million valuation, embossed in gold on the leather cover. Derek had no idea that his pointless wife now controlled the very pharmaceutical suppliers his construction company's medical facilities division depended on. He had no idea that Vanessa's family business, the medical equipment company that provided 30% of his revenue, operated on contracts negotiated with Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings. He had no idea that the bank threatening to call his business loans early was owned by Claire's late father's investment group. He had no idea that the pointless woman he was divorcing on Mother's Day in front of their children, while she clutched inheritance papers that made her fortune 15 times larger than his, was about to show him exactly what powerless looked like. But who was Claire Montgomery really? And what would a woman who'd spent 15 years being called worthless do when she suddenly held all the power? How far would a mother go to protect her children from a man who just taught them that love was disposable? And what crushing revelation was Derek about to face when he realized his mistress had been using him for something far more calculating than love? Claire's hand shook as she signed the divorce papers at the kitchen table, watching Derek's satisfied smirk through her tears. He thought they were tears of devastation. He had no idea they were tears of rage finally released after years of swallowing his subtle cruelties. Emma, only 8 years old, ran to her room crying. Lucas, barely 6, asked his father why Mommy was crying on Mother's Day. Derek told him Mommy would understand someday that Daddy needed to be happy. The casual cruelty of it nearly broke Claire's carefully maintained composure. She wanted to slam the inheritance papers on the table, watch his face drain of color, make him choke on his arrogance. But something her father had taught her long ago, before their estrangement, whispered in her memory. The best revenge is served cold, calculated, and completely unexpected. Let them think they've won. Let them celebrate. Let them make plans. Then show them who really holds the power. Claire folded the divorce papers and handed them back to Derek with steady hands. She asked for nothing in the divorce, shocking him into momentary silence. No alimony, she said. No split of his business assets. She only wanted the house, full custody of the children with generous visitation for him, and child support at the state minimum. Derek's lawyer, sitting uncomfortably at the end of the table, raised his eyebrows. This was too easy. But Derek didn't question good fortune. He signed immediately, already texting Vanessa under the table about their Vegas wedding next weekend. Claire watched him, memorizing every detail of his face in this moment of triumph. She'd need this memory later, when doubt crept in, when mercy tempted her. She'd need to remember that he'd called her pointless, signed away his children on Mother's Day, and texted his pregnant mistress while their daughter sobbed in the next room. After Derek left, taking only his clothes and laptop, Claire finally opened the full inheritance folder. The details staggered her. Her father, Richard Montgomery, hadn't just left her wealthy. He'd left her an empire. Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings controlled 17 manufacturing plants, supplied medications to 42% of American hospitals, held patents on 6 breakthrough cancer treatments, and owned substantial stakes in medical technology companies worldwide. The letter from her father, written a week before his death, explained everything. He'd been wrong to cut her off for marrying Derek. He'd watched from afar as she'd struggled, suffered, persevered. He'd seen her strength in choosing love over money, even when that love proved worthless. Now he was giving her the power she'd earned through years of quiet endurance. That night, after putting Emma and Lucas to bed with extra long hugs and promises that everything would be okay, Claire made the first call. Her father's attorney, Gerald Patterson, had been waiting for it. He'd known Richard Montgomery for 40 years and had watched the old man's face when he'd learned how Derek treated his daughter. Gerald had helped Richard craft something more sophisticated than simple revenge. It was a carefully constructed reset of Claire's entire life, removing every obstacle and replacing Derek's betrayal with opportunity. Gerald walked Claire through the empire structure. Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings was the parent company, but underneath were subsidiary corporations, investment vehicles, and silent partnerships that touched dozens of industries, including construction, specifically medical facility construction. Even more specifically, Derek's primary revenue source. Derek's company, Summit Construction Group, had grown explosively in the past 3 years by specializing in medical buildings, hospitals, clinics, urgent care centers, pharmaceutical labs. His success hinged on 2 factors: cheap pharmaceutical-grade materials supplied by Montgomery subsidiaries at preferential rates Derek didn't know existed, and medical equipment contracts with MedTech Solutions, Vanessa's family company, which operated exclusively through Montgomery distribution networks. Derek thought he'd built his success. He had no idea he'd been succeeding on Claire's father's silent charity, Richard's way of providing for his grandchildren through their father's business. That charity was about to end. Claire learned something else that night that made her blood run cold. Vanessa's pursuit of Derek hadn't been random attraction. MedTech Solutions was drowning in debt, kept afloat only by their Montgomery contracts. Vanessa's father, Thomas Hart, had sent his daughter to seduce Derek after learning Richard Montgomery was dying, betting that controlling Derek meant controlling access to Claire's inevitable inheritance. Vanessa's pregnancy wasn't an accident. It was a calculated play to legally bind herself to the Montgomery fortune through Derek's children's half-sibling. The woman wasn't just a mistress. She was a corporate spy, and Derek was too foolish to see he'd been weaponized against his own wife. Gerald showed Claire the documented proof: Vanessa's emails to her father discussing the strategy, text messages about timing the pregnancy, even a recorded phone call where Vanessa laughed about Derek's gullibility. How easy it was to make him feel powerful and desired while she positioned herself for the real prize. Claire sat in her father's old study, surrounded by the evidence of an elaborate betrayal that made Derek's affair look almost innocent by comparison. The next morning, Claire began her education in power. She'd spent 15 years as a wife and mother, her business degree from Northwestern gathering dust while she managed soccer practices and parent-teacher conferences. But her father's empire didn't run itself, and Gerald had assembled Richard's entire executive team to meet their new owner. They gathered in the Montgomery Building's boardroom, 30 floors above Chicago, these titans of industry waiting to judge whether Richard's daughter could fill his shoes. Claire walked in wearing her mother's vintage Chanel suit, the one she'd kept preserved in the back of her closet like a memory of a different life. She'd been up until 3 in the morning reading every document Gerald provided about Montgomery Holdings operations, competitive landscape, and strategic challenges. She understood something these executives didn't expect. She'd been running a complex operation for years. It was called a household, and it required the same skills they valued: resource allocation, crisis management, negotiation, long-term planning, and the ability to make everyone feel valued while accomplishing your objectives. Her father's CFO, Margaret Chen, tested her immediately with a question about pharmaceutical patent cliffs and generic competition. Claire responded by citing specific Montgomery patents expiring in the next 18 months, then proposing a strategy her father had outlined in his notes: accelerate the company's biotech research division, pivot from defending old patents to acquiring promising startups with breakthrough treatments. The room went quiet. Margaret smiled. Over the next 4 hours, Claire absorbed a masterclass in running a pharmaceutical empire. She learned that her father hadn't just built a company. He'd built a fortress of interconnected businesses that protected each other through strategic dependencies. Hospitals needed Montgomery's medications. Medical construction companies needed Montgomery's specialized pharmaceutical-grade materials. Equipment manufacturers needed Montgomery's distribution networks. Insurers needed Montgomery's cost structures. Everyone in healthcare, at some level, needed Montgomery. And now everyone needed Claire. She made her first executive decision that afternoon. Effective immediately, all preferential pricing contracts were under review. Any business relationship not operating at market rates would be renegotiated or terminated within 90 days. She watched her executives exchange glances. They knew what this meant. Derek's construction company had been operating on pricing structures that existed only because Richard Montgomery had wanted to ensure his grandchildren's father stayed solvent. Those structures were about to disappear. Claire's second decision was more personal. She wanted a complete audit of MedTech Solutions' contracts with Montgomery Holdings, including any verbal agreements or informal arrangements. Margaret Chen's smile grew wider. Derek's first indication that something had changed came 3 days after the divorce was finalized, while he was in Vegas marrying Vanessa in a chapel decorated with fake flowers and presided over by an Elvis impersonator. His materials supplier, a company called Apex Pharmaceutical Supplies that he'd worked with for 5 years, sent an email notification that their contract was under review and pricing would be adjusted to market rates effective immediately. Derek barely noticed. He was too busy posting wedding photos on social media, making sure Claire saw them. Making sure everyone saw that he'd upgraded from his frumpy ex-wife to the sophisticated beauty in the white dress smiling up at him. Vanessa played her part perfectly, whispering about the empire they'd built together now that Derek was free from Claire's dead weight. What neither Derek nor Vanessa knew was that Apex Pharmaceutical Supplies was a Montgomery Holdings subsidiary. The preferential pricing Derek had enjoyed represented a 42% discount from market rates. Losing it would devastate his profit margins on every active project. The second indication came 5 days later, when Derek returned from his honeymoon to find his largest client, Metropolitan Hospital Network, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss cost overruns on their expansion project. The hospital's CFO explained that their medication supplier, Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings, had flagged concerns about the pharmaceutical-grade materials being used in their new facilities. Apparently, there were questions about whether Summit Construction Group was using appropriately certified materials given their unusually low pricing structures. The hospital needed documentation proving material compliance, or they'd have to halt construction pending a full audit. Derek felt his first flutter of unease. He'd been buying materials from Apex for years without question, trusting their certifications. Now he'd need to prove their materials met pharmaceutical standards for hospital construction, documentation he'd never bothered to maintain because Apex had always assured him everything was compliant. He called Apex immediately. The representative who answered informed him that as their contract was under review, they could no longer provide expedited documentation requests. Standard processing time was 60 to 90 days. Derek felt sweat break out across his forehead. 60 days of halted construction on his biggest project would destroy him financially. His third indication came that evening, in the form of a phone call from his bank. The line of credit securing Summit Construction Group's operations was being called for immediate review given material changes in the business's operational structure and supply chain relationships. Derek would need to provide updated financial projections, proof of stable supplier relationships, and evidence of contract security within 30 days, or the bank would consider early termination of the credit facility. Claire spent that week being a mother first and an empire owner second. She took Emma and Lucas to their favorite park, helped with homework, read bedtime stories, and carefully explained that mommy and daddy living separately didn't mean either parent loved them less. She didn't mention that daddy was in Vegas marrying the woman who'd helped destroy their family. She didn't mention that daddy had called mommy pointless in front of them. She simply loved them, consistently and completely, the way she'd always done. But at night after the children slept, Claire studied her father's empire with the intensity of a general planning a war. She learned the pressure points, the dependencies, the invisible threads that connected seemingly separate businesses. She discovered that her father had been a genius at creating leverage through strategic relationships. He'd never forced anyone into anything. He'd simply made himself indispensable, then set the terms of that indispensability. Now Claire held those terms, and she was rewriting them. Margaret Chen became her most valuable teacher and fiercest ally. The CFO had watched Richard Montgomery build his empire over 4 decades and recognized in Claire the same strategic instinct her father possessed. Margaret explained something crucial. Destroying Derek would be easy, but it would be crude and ultimately unsatisfying. Derek was a small man who'd gotten lucky through connections he didn't understand. Simply crushing him would make Claire look petty. Instead, Margaret suggested, let Derek destroy himself through his own arrogance and ignorance. Remove the invisible supports Richard had provided. Replace preferential treatment with market rate reality. Let Derek experience what true business competition felt like without the safety net he'd never known existed. Then watch him fail while trying desperately to understand what went wrong. The beauty of this approach was its deniability. Claire wasn't attacking Derek. She was simply running her business properly, eliminating below-market contracts that made no strategic sense. If Derek's company couldn't survive without special treatment, that was Derek's problem, not Claire's. Margaret also shared her research on Vanessa and MedTech solutions. The picture was damning. MedTech was bleeding cash, sustained only by their exclusive distribution relationship with Montgomery Holdings, a relationship negotiated by Thomas Hart and Richard Montgomery 20 years ago when both companies were smaller. The contract was outdated, giving MedTech preferential treatment that no longer made business sense. Worse, MedTech had been leveraging their Montgomery relationship to secure overpriced contracts with hospitals, essentially using Montgomery's reputation to charge premium prices for mediocre equipment. Richard had tolerated this for years out of loyalty to an old friend, but Thomas Hart had repaid that loyalty by sending his daughter to seduce and manipulate Richard's son-in-law. 2 weeks after the divorce, Derek's world started crumbling in earnest. Metropolitan Hospital Network suspended his expansion project pending material certification, a suspension that triggered penalty clauses in his contract, costing him $50,000 per week. His materials costs from Apex suddenly jumped 42%, retroactive to the start of his current projects, transforming healthy profit margins into devastating losses. His bank demanded immediate repayment of $200,000 in credit line draws, citing concerns about business viability, and his second largest client, a pharmaceutical research facility, canceled their contract entirely after learning that Summit Construction Group's material supplier was under compliance review. Derek couldn't understand what was happening. He'd been careful, professional, diligent. His business had been thriving. How could everything fall apart so quickly? Vanessa, now his wife and business partner, suggested they leverage her family's connections. MedTech Solutions had relationships throughout the medical industry. Her father could help. Derek, desperate and prideful, resisted asking Thomas Hart for help. He was supposed to be the successful one, the man who'd outgrown his pointless first wife. Admitting failure to his new father-in-law felt impossible, but as his financial situation deteriorated, pride became a luxury he couldn't afford. He called Thomas Hart and explained the crisis. Thomas listened carefully, then delivered news that made Derek's stomach drop. MedTech Solutions was facing its own crisis. Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings had notified them that their distribution contract, set to auto-renew next month, would instead be terminated. Montgomery was bringing distribution in-house, eliminating the middleman markup that MedTech had been collecting for 2 decades. Without the Montgomery contract, MedTech would lose 60% of its revenue overnight. The company would likely declare bankruptcy within 6 months. Thomas Hart's voice was cold as he explained this to Derek. His plan to secure the Montgomery fortune through Derek's connection to Claire had been predicated on Richard Montgomery being dead and Claire being vulnerable, divorced, and desperate. Instead, Claire had somehow taken control of her inheritance with stunning speed, professionalized the business operations, and started eliminating unprofitable relationships with ruthless efficiency, including the relationship with MedTech that had been Thomas's entire strategy. Derek felt reality shifting beneath his feet. Thomas Hart had been using him. Vanessa had been using him. The pregnancy, the affair, the marriage, everything had been calculated manipulation to position the Hart family for access to the Montgomery fortune. And it had failed spectacularly. Worse, Derek was now legally bound to Vanessa, carrying her child, while both their businesses collapsed. He'd destroyed his marriage to Claire for a woman who'd seen him as nothing more than a tool. The crushing revelation hit Derek 3 weeks after his Vegas wedding, when his attorney called with alarming news. Claire Montgomery wasn't just Claire Montgomery anymore. She was Claire Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in America. The pointless housewife he'd divorced was worth approximately $900 million. The woman he'd called worthless while she made breakfast for his children controlled an empire that supplied medications to nearly half the hospitals in the country. The woman he'd discarded on Mother's Day now had more power in the medical industry than anyone Derek had ever met. His attorney explained what this meant for Derek's business situation. Every crisis Summit Construction Group faced, from the Apex pricing changes to the Metropolitan Hospital suspension to the bank's credit review, traced back to Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings. Not directly, not obviously, but through the interconnected web of subsidiaries, partnerships, and relationships that define Montgomery's empire. Derek wasn't being attacked. He was being removed from a support system he'd never known existed. Richard Montgomery had been quietly ensuring his son-in-law's business succeeded, creating the conditions for Summit Construction Group to thrive without Derek ever realizing it. Those conditions were gone now. Claire wasn't sabotaging Derek. She was simply treating him like any other contractor operating in the medical construction space, with market rate pricing, standard compliance requirements, and no special consideration. The problem was, Derek's entire business model had been built on the special consideration he'd never recognized. Without it, Summit Construction Group wasn't competitive. Derek sat in his office, the walls covered with awards and photos of completed projects, and felt 15 years of his life recontextualize itself. He hadn't been a self-made success. He'd been Richard Montgomery's charity case, kept afloat so Claire's children would have a stable father. Every triumph, every milestone, every moment of pride had been built on a foundation of assistance he'd been too arrogant to notice. And when he'd finally achieved enough success to feel independent, he'd use that independence to betray the woman whose father had made it all possible. The irony was devastating. Vanessa, sitting across from him in his office, had gone pale as Derek explained the situation. She'd seduced and married him believing he was the key to the Montgomery fortune. Instead, he was the fool who divorced the Montgomery fortune on Mother's Day while calling it pointless. Her father's plan hadn't just failed. It had positioned the Hart family as adversaries to one of the most powerful companies in American healthcare. Thomas Hart called an hour later, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings had just sent termination notices to every single client MedTech Solutions served. Claire stood in her father's office, looking out over Chicago's skyline, feeling the weight of what she'd done and what she was about to do. Margaret Chen sat across from her, reviewing the cascade of consequences Claire's decisions had triggered. Derek's business would likely declare bankruptcy within 60 days. MedTech Solutions would follow within 90. The Hart family's net worth would be reduced to almost nothing, and Derek himself would be personally liable for millions in contract penalties and loan obligations. It was comprehensive destruction, achieved without Claire ever speaking Derek's name in a business context. She'd simply optimized Montgomery Holdings operations according to sound business principles. That the optimization happened to remove every artificial advantage Derek and the Hearts had exploited was just good corporate governance. Margaret asked the question Claire had been wrestling with all week. Was this enough, or did Claire want to go further? Montgomery Holdings had the power to make Derek and Vanessa's lives far more difficult. They could trigger personal liability clauses, push creditors to pursue aggressive collection, even make it difficult for Derek to find employment in the construction industry going forward. Claire thought about her children. Emma had been asking why Daddy seemed angry all the time during his visitation days. Lucas had mentioned that the new wife seemed sad and cried a lot. Her children were watching this unfold, learning lessons about love, betrayal, power, and revenge that would shape their entire lives. What did she want to teach them? That power meant crushing anyone who hurt you? Or that power meant having the choice to show mercy? Claire made her decision. She told Margaret to halt any further action against Derek's business. Summit Construction Group would fail on its own without additional pressure. MedTech Solutions was already finished. That was sufficient. But Claire wanted one more thing. She wanted Derek to know, explicitly and undeniably, that she had chosen to stop. That his survival, such as it would be, existed only because she permitted it. She wanted him to live the rest of his life knowing that the pointless woman he'd divorced on Mother's Day had held his entire future in her hands and had decided he wasn't worth the effort of complete destruction. Margaret smiled. It was a more devastating punishment than bankruptcy. Claire composed the message herself, delivered through attorneys to maintain appropriate distance. It informed Derek that Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings had completed its operational review and would be implementing no further changes to supplier relationships or contract structures. All pending business decisions regarding Summit Construction Group and related entities would proceed according to standard industry practices. The letter's final paragraph was the knife. Mrs. Montgomery wishes to convey that she holds no personal animus toward Mr. Wells and hopes he finds success in his future endeavors. Derek read Claire's letter in his nearly empty office, having already laid off most of his staff. The words "no personal animus" felt like a slap. She destroyed his business, exposed his marriage as a manipulation, and revealed him as a fraud who'd succeeded only through connections he hadn't earned, and she felt no personal animus? The cruelty of it exceeded anything he'd done to her. She'd taken away even the dignity of being worth her hatred. Vanessa sat next to him, her pregnancy now showing, neither of them speaking. Their marriage had become a tomb of resentment and recrimination. She blamed him for being too stupid to realize his wife was an heiress. He blamed her for using him in a scheme that had turned him into a pawn. They were bound together now by debt, failure, and a child neither of them had wanted for the right reasons. Thomas Hart had stopped returning Derek's calls. MedTech Solutions was in bankruptcy proceedings, the Hart family wealth evaporating in legal fees and creditor claims. Vanessa would inherit nothing but her father's mistakes. Derek had destroyed his family for a woman who'd been destroying him the entire time. The real punishment, Derek realized, wasn't the business failure or the financial ruin. It was understanding. For 15 years, he'd treated Claire like she was lucky to have him. He dismissed her contributions, minimized her sacrifices, made her feel small so he could feel big. He called her pointless while she made breakfast for his children on Mother's Day because some part of him needed to believe he'd outgrown her, that his success meant he deserved better. Now he understood that every moment of his success had existed because Claire's father had built a safety net beneath him. Not for Derek's sake, but for Claire's. For the grandchildren Richard Montgomery had never met because Derek had demanded Claire choose between her family fortune and their marriage. Richard had chosen to support Claire's choice by supporting the man she'd chosen, even when that man was unworthy. And Derek had responded to that invisible generosity by calling Richard's daughter pointless and divorcing her on Mother's Day. The letter in Derek's hands shook. Claire had crushed him, not through revenge but through clarity. She'd shown him exactly who he was, a small man whose brief success had been borrowed, whose confidence had been unearned, and whose cruelty had been directed at the only person who'd ever actually believed in him. 6 months later, Claire sat in the same kitchen where Derek had called her pointless, watching Emma and Lucas do homework at the table. The house was paid off, the children's college funds fully secured, and Claire's role as CEO of Montgomery Pharmaceutical Holdings was becoming more natural every day. She discovered she was good at it, more than good. She had her father's instinct for strategy and her mother's gift for reading people. The company was thriving under her leadership, expanding into new markets and investing heavily in breakthrough treatments for childhood diseases. It was meaningful work, the kind she'd forgotten existed during her years of managing carpools and organizing birthday parties. Derek had visitation every other weekend. He arrived on time, never mentioned his business failures, and treated Claire with a careful politeness that felt like penance. He'd sold the house he'd shared with Vanessa, moved into a small apartment, and taken a job as a project manager for someone else's construction company. Vanessa had left him 3 months after their son was born, moving back in with her parents and filing for divorce. Derek paid child support for 3 children now, from 2 marriages, both of which had ended because he'd fundamentally misunderstood what mattered. Sometimes Claire felt pity for him. Sometimes she felt nothing at all. Mostly she felt grateful that her father had given her the power to choose her response instead of being forced into victimhood. She'd chosen not to be destroyed by Derek's betrayal. She'd chosen to reclaim her life, her power, and her purpose. And she'd chosen, in the end, to let Derek live with the consequences of his choices without making those consequences any worse than they needed to be. Emma looked up from her math homework and asked if Daddy was okay. She'd noticed he seemed sad. Claire told her daughter that Daddy was learning some important lessons about treating people with respect and that sometimes lessons are hard. She told Emma that the most important thing was that both her parents loved her and her brother completely, even when they couldn't love each other anymore. That night, after the children were asleep, Claire stood in her father's study looking at his portrait on the wall. She finally understood why he'd cut her off from marrying Derek. Richard had seen what Claire couldn't, that Derek was a taker, not a partner. But Richard had also understood something more profound. He'd let Claire make her own choice, learn her own lessons, and find her own strength. Then he'd given her the power to rebuild her life on her own terms. The $900 million empire wasn't really about money, it was about choice, about having the resources to leave a bad situation, protect her children, and build something meaningful. It was about never being called pointless again by anyone who couldn't see her value. Claire touched her father's portrait gently. She'd spent 15 years thinking she'd disappointed him by choosing love over wealth. Now she understood she'd earned his respect by surviving that choice with grace, raising his grandchildren with love, and proving that her strength didn't depend on his money. He'd simply given her back what Derek had tried to take, the power to define her own worth. And Derek? He'd wanted a woman who made him feel powerful. He'd gotten Vanessa, and it had crushed him. Sometimes, Claire thought, the universe had a perfect sense of irony.